Hello, role-playing people, and in this episode we're continuing our investigation of Sabbat culture. Though it was quite a while ago, a year ago to be more precise, in the previous episode I mentioned some of the political factions of the Sabbat, so in this one we're going to detail those groups, their views and goals, and their overall standing within the sect. Something I've mentioned before and will mention again now, the 1999 Guide to the Sabbat and the 2014 V20 Rites of the Blood handle factions a little bit differently. The Guide to the Sabbat lists and details factions starting on page 34, and it includes the following: the Black Hand, the Inquisition, and the Loyalist faction as major factions of the sect, while the status quo, the moderates, the ultra-conservatives, the Old World Zemitzi, the La Sombra Antitribu, the Order of Saint Blaise, the Children of the Drakon, and the Infernalists are treated as minor factions. Rites of the Blood immediately addresses and explains very clearly on page 47 the fact that the Inquisition and the Black Hand are not political factions per se. They are technically subgroups of the sect, but joining these militant orders requires setting aside political preferences, passing a plethora of tests, and having or developing just the right skill set for the job. It's like joining the army. You sign the contract and swear an oath, you have no more free speech. Your political opinion doesn't matter anymore. You cannot, under any circumstance, criticize sect decisions, and you don't get to decide which direction the sect is going to take. You are expected to execute, to do as needed, to follow orders. The Black Hand is the special forces of the Sabbat, the military elite, the very edge and tip of the Sword of Caine. Thus, the attitude of its members is almost always authoritarian. It's often referred to as a sect within a sect, and for good reason, since its members are spread out and infiltrated in other packs, silently maintaining a semblance of order among Loyalists, or carrying out covert operations within mainstream Sabbat and outside of it when needed. Similarly, the Inquisition, whose members doubled from 15 to only 30 worldwide, according to the 1999 Guide to the Sabbat, which is not a lot, really, is a subgroup predominantly dedicated to rooting out Infernalists. So again, their duties are maintaining some balance within the sect by preventing diabolical practices. Yes, they are on the cusp of becoming a political faction, since the Inquisition indeed has the power to depose any rank from Ductus or Pack Priest to Archbishop, should they be found guilty of infernal dealings, and though its members wield a lot of power over political leaders of the sect, they are too small a faction and too narrow in scope to be considered political. The Inquisition, though it is feared for its unbelievably cruel methods, infamous among the Cainites, it wouldn't function without the Church of Caine, without the mainstream clergy which supports their endeavors and sees the need, recognizes the need for such an institution. Just like the Black Hand is the covert military elite, we can somewhat jokingly say the Inquisition is the occult anti-infernalism elite of Sabbat clergy. In both cases, however, these factions are not political, and the same goes for Old World Zemitzi, La Sombra Antitribu, the Children of the Drakon, the Order of Saint Blaise, and Infernalists. The La Sombra Antitribu cannot be a faction of the sect, since they are literally anti-tribu. They are apostates. They are in bed with a Camarilla. Sure, an anti-tribu branch of the Clan of Shadows exists, but it's not actually part of the Sabbat. So having them on this list of Sabbat factions doesn't really make sense. The Old World Zemitzi and Children of the Drakon are subgroups which are formed around clan identity or lineage, first and foremost, and both are allies of the sect, strictly by necessity. They frequently abstain from sect meetings, the old world fiends, or even abstain from observing the ritus, as is the case of the Dracons. But the Sabbat acknowledges there are far worse crimes than being an elder and having a large domain, right? As long as both Old World and Drakon Tzimisce are not doing the bidding of the antediluvians, and are at least occasionally useful to the sect, allowing passage or even hosting nomadic pacts and the like, or assisting the war effort financially, they get a pass. The Order of Saint Blaise is also less of a political faction and more of a secret subgroup dedicated to infiltrating the Catholic Church. By controlling even small shards of such a valuable asset, these Cainites bring in funding and herd for their sect, so what they are doing is undoubtedly useful, but again, it doesn't show a particular political direction or even a political agenda for the entire sect. When it comes to Infernalists, the book itself says they aren't a proper faction, but more like an illness that plagues the sect. Sure, you might find a quick and sneaky way of grabbing more power and learning a few interesting disciplines or dark thaumaturgy paths, but you're selling yourself into what is probably eternal servitude to a demonic entity. How is that different from selling yourself into servitude to the antediluvians? Well, to most Sabbat, it's not, and the fact that infernal practices are spreading, they can seduce and affect multiple members of multiple pacts. The pacts themselves, right, the very foundation of Cainite society, is reason enough to have the Inquisition around and give it plenty of support. Infernalism is indeed an issue, a serious issue within the Sabbat, but yeah, Infernalists are not necessarily united altogether. They are not a faction, just a very risky practice. So what all of this means is that the proper political factions within the Sabbat, according to the 1999 guide, are Loyalists, treated as a major faction, then status quo, ultra-conservatives, and moderates, treated as minor factions. The Panders, at this point, are barely a political faction, since they are willing to rub up against anyone who will increase their recognition or legitimacy, and as a unified group of Kaitif, it seems to me like, again, this is mainly an air quotes, clan-centered political thing, not a sect-wide faction that anyone can adhere to. After the Third Sabbat Civil War, the shortest of the three, which lasted about 100 nights in the latter half of 1957, the Panders were recognized by both La Sombra and Tzimisce as a distinct entity, similar to a clan or a bloodline, which then formally became a part of the sect. With that, the mob was appeased, and the Panders carried on trying to increase their standing within the Sabbat ever since. Nothing too interesting happening there currently. Alright, so we only have 4 actual political factions we need to discuss, and in order to present them properly, we will quickly flip to page 181 of the 1999 guide, where these groups are explained in a little more detail. The Loyalists want to stay true to the goal of the First Anarch Revolt, which is indisputable, undeniable freedom for the individual Cainite. Yes, achieving this state meant destroying the oppressive antediluvians, but that act of destruction was simply a means to an end, not a goal in itself. Loyalists value freedom above all else. That is their most precious ideal, which must be preserved and continuously fought for, especially with other more authoritarian members of the Sabbat. Though they are frequently antagonized by the other factions, the Loyalists themselves cannot comprehend that what they are doing is harming the sect and throwing it into disorder. How could it? From their point of view, they are simply staying true to the very purpose of the revolt which birthed the Sabbat. They are keeping the sect free. They are keeping the individual Cainite free challenging the other factions or leaders every time they want to impose or force a certain course of action, because it's so tempting, isn't it? It's so easy to just bow your head once and give in to peer pressure or give in to authority, and then, when things are frightening or critical once again, do it one more time. Make that compromise, then another time, over and over, until you've forgotten that the sect is supposed to be founded on freedom, and the only authority your higher-ups have is the one you accepted. Though the Code of Milan was agreed upon by all factions in 1803, it's easy to see Loyalists will praise and bring up Article 11 or the 3 articles of the Addenda 14, 15, and 16 more frequently than articles which invite conformity or submission, such as Articles 2, 3, 5, or Article 13. They are not fans of any kind of edict which limits personal freedom, such as the Purchase Pact or the Code of Milan, which they believe are more of guidelines and should not be treated as word of law. The only law is freedom. Despite this, they are a major faction to the detriment of moderates, which are the most numerous and continuously expanding. And this I will read straight from the book. The Sabbat has moderates, a category in which most of the Sabbat tends to fall politically. The moderate faction attracts the Gangrel, Malkavian, Toreador, and Nosferatu Antitribu, and the Serpents of Light, but it doesn't automatically include them. It's a growing faction, one that sees the sect becoming more structured and wishes to keep this from happening. The moderates believe that crusades should be called only when absolutely necessary, usually because crusades call for following orders. The moderates acquiesce to orders, but they question their leaders if they disagree with them. The status quo doesn't like this, and the moderates know it, so they follow orders mostly to remain in good standing." End quote. So moderates are the most numerous, and they are in continuous expansion. They question leaders but disobey less frequently than the Loyalists, yet somehow they're a minor faction? They're politically overpowered? See, to me this just doesn't make sense, because the Loyalists are disorganized and they only stick together on a wider scale when they're actively politically threatened by the other factions, or when a sect-wide decision threatens to limit their freedom. But moderates who have majority privilege, they stick together more frequently and are more malleable when it comes to taking orders, unless said orders severely limit freedom for an extended period of time, such as the duration of a crusade. But these guys are second place? It doesn't make sense to me, but hey, this is just my opinion. Then we have the status quo, which aims to keep things as they are now. They believe the sect is balanced enough, they are in a state of balance, and hey, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. Its members don't want to see an increase in structure or authoritarianism, whether conservative, military, or clerical, but they also don't want to destabilize or disorganize the sect further by giving more power to the Loyalists and moderates. They believe the edicts are very useful and everyone should follow them, understanding the necessity of supporting leaders, the Black Hand, and the Inquisition. Status quo thrive in positions of leadership and authority, but they take great care to not visibly abuse their station, making sure to phrase their orders as suggestions or requests, explaining and emphasizing why it's in everyone's best interest to follow a certain course of action, while pointing out the unpleasant consequences of diverging from this plan. Members of the status quo are manipulative and charismatic, and if they can occupy the same position for as long as possible without promotions or demotions, it suits them just fine. Leave the idealist to the Loyalists, leave the heroics to the ultra-conservatives or the Black Hand, and let those who are in power stay right where they are. The last faction on this list is the ultra-conservatives, whose members are, by far, the most authoritarian of the bunch. I mean, if you yourself as an elder would have survived 3 Sabbat civil wars and noticed just how much land, wealth, and herd was lost to the Camarilla due to infighting, lack of structure, and stubborn, idealistic refusal to follow simple orders, you'd advocate for stricter adherence to the edicts, too. This faction believes the edicts are not enforced strongly enough. They believe freedom should be limited, for now, at least as a temporary compromise, in favor of order, obedience, and stability. Gehenna is right around the corner. The pawns of the antediluvians have been gaining ground, so it's time to organize the Sabbat into a force that can truly withstand such threats. And yes, sometimes orders will be issued, and the ranks should carry them out without debate. Once the war is won, everyone can do whatever, but for now, in this very critical time, don't serve your own freedom, serve the sect. Ultra-conservatives value strong leaders who aren't afraid to rule with rein and whip, making frequent use of intimidation, force, and status authority. Their diplomacy usually comes as a quote from the Book of Nod, which suggests obedience, reaffirms the importance of law, and reminds of the omens of the end times, which are all around. This faction probably makes the most use of monomachy as well, to remove weak leaders, so naturally the remaining ones are strong and confident in their ability. Final death might come from both an enraged, oppressed loyalist accusing your use of force, or from a superior who cannot stand your failure to follow their orders and keep the ranks in line. So really, these Cainites have nerves of steel, and they know it's better to meet your end in glorious battle, serving the sect, than it is to meet your end as a result of internal squabbling at the hands of those who are supposed to be your brothers and sisters. Alright, these are the factions according to the 1999 player guide, and like I said in the previous episode, V20 beautifully builds on this information, expanding it without cutting any previous content. Starting on page 46 of Rites of the Blood, we are presented with the more recent political situation of the sect, and the main political factions are ultra-conservatives, the Orthodoxy, the Order of Saint Blaise, and lastly, the Loyalists. The lesser factions are status quo and panders. In V20, the term moderate is used to refer to a Cainite without strong political ideals, and because they have no unifying cause, they also have no faction ritus, unlike the others. But this also explains in a single sentence what the 1999 guide made me so confused about. So, moderates are the most numerous, but they don't really care about politics, and don't actually adhere to a particular direction they want the sect to take. Thus, they don't have a voice within the sect or too much political influence. Well, they have close to no political influence. This V20 book not only makes clear distinctions between political factions that any Cainite can adhere to, and these elite executive subgroups like the Black Hand or the Inquisition, but it makes sure to present this information in one go within the same chapter, so players don't read one thing on page 34 and another thing altogether on page 181, as is the case with the 1999 guide. In V20, the Order of Saint Blaise isn't just a secret order which infiltrates and uses the Catholic Church, but an actual political faction which advocates for a closer and careful manipulation of mortal resources on a sect-wide level. Traditionally, the Sabbat don't really care about their mortal herds. They actively show disdain for or outright abuse their relatively small unkept flocks because the members themselves are eventually forced into situations which rob them of their humanity and empathy. Humanity as a path of morality is unsustainable long-term within a sect which makes human sacrifices, exsanguinating mortal victims during blood feasts, or using human beings as stage props to be killed by audience participants when they perform theatrical pieces in honor of Caine, right? But I did mention throughout previous episodes that this sect is learning and changing, so now I want to point your attention to a canonical character who is very much to my liking, Vasantasena, a millennium-old Malkavian antitribu who's been a long-time critic of paths of enlightenment and long-time supporter of acknowledging the need for humanity within the sect. A very loyalist idea, really, but a very good question nonetheless, especially when we consider the goals and ideals of the first Anarch Revolt. Why should a Cainite be forced to take part in activities which rob them of their humanity? Shouldn't they have the freedom to preserve and nurture their preferred moral path? Do they necessarily have to adhere to a list of moral paths? Where's the freedom in that? In the rise of the Order of Saint Blaise as a major political faction, we can see the Sabbat getting closer to the mortals in their cities, and by implication taking the same approach as the Camarilla, thus behaving in a more humane manner and holding on to their own humanity, which is, from my point of view, really nice to see. Vasantasena's story thus illustrates what successful loyalist idealism and leadership through inspiration can do for this sect. It is a clear example of why no faction should be treated strictly as antagonists, because all of them have something to add and contribute to the Sabbat and to the growth of the sect. I will quote from the book really quickly. The Order's contributions to the Sword of Caine are unparalleled and have been unquestionably useful. In these modern nights of cell phone cameras and constant mortal surveillance, the Order of Saint Blaise has become unquestionably integral to the survival of the sect. Still, as much as they are useful and utilized, many members of the Sabbat continue to look down on the Order, claiming that the vampires of this faction are a little too willing to, air quotes, play with their food. This, my friends, is the Sabbat staying true to its ideals and fights, while integrating some very much welcome tactics of the Camarilla. I love this so much. But we come to our last political faction, a brand new one, mind you, which was written up only in V20, and that is the Orthodox faction. So you have all these other groups trying to one-up each other and gain the upper hand, each pulling the sect in a certain direction, but at the end of the day, if everyone partakes in the Valdery, for instance, and the Vinculum binds everyone together, an ultra-conservative under the influence of such a bond might show a little more empathy or leniency for a loyalist comrade, while loyalists under the influence of the Vinculum might bow their heads and follow orders more often, out of attachment and vitae-induced emotion, if not submission to authority. The Orthodox Sabbat believe spirituality and ritus are the greatest strengths of the sect, the glue, the unifying factor that binds everyone together and allows Cainites with opposing political views to coexist. Religion and politics are usually very divisive topics, and it's no different in the Sabbat. A return to ritus, however, keeps disagreements and aggression in check. It forces packmates, or indeed the Cainites of a whole city, to care for each other, at least marginally, and is precisely what the sect needs in turbulent times. Thus, like all of the other factions, the Orthodoxy does have a point, and it advocates for more frequent uses of ritus with larger and more consistent participation from everyone, more power for the clergy, and surprisingly, a narrower definition of heresy so that Sabbat occultists can research and develop new sorcerous weapons and tactics against the enemies of the sect. Wonderful. Having presented the factions according to both books, I want to quickly point out how amazing the writer's direction was here, giving players and storytellers alike a feeling of chronology, of continuity, and really expanding on the political system of the Sabbat. If we take elements from both Revised and V20, there is not a single aspect of what defines this sect that isn't reflected in one of its factions. And the feeling of progress, a metamorphosis, chronology, comes from the fact that the Loyalists used to be a dominant political position, but after repeated failures on their behalf, more and more Cainites acknowledged the need for order and structure. So now, in V20, the ultra-conservatives, which used to be a lesser faction, rose to the same level of influence, and they are maintaining that influence by making promises of power and status to the panders. So the Sabbat right wing is gaining ground. The Siege of Atlanta, 1999, shows us just how destructive the Cainites are when they work together. They absolutely wreck the Camarilla. They can be successful in this conflict. Arguably, you could say this is a win for the status quo as well, which does indeed desire a certain level of order and stagnant hierarchy, but no, the status failed because their influence and desire for a certain balance was lost due to new factions appearing, factions which shouldn't have appeared or risen at all, according to the status quo. The Sabbat didn't stay the same, it adapted in order to survive. The Order of Saint Blaise managed to infiltrate not only the Catholic Church as it initially tried, but it found itself adopting the same tactics as the Camarilla, which, in the long run, might actually even out the playing field in the conflict between these two sects. And given that being closer to mortals reminded everyone of the need to maintain one's humanity, even within the Sword of Caine, the Church of Caine noticed a decline in ritus participation, given the fact that humanity is quite incompatible with repeated blood feasts or even games of instincts, which are played using human victims. Thus, the Orthodoxy appears on the scene to remind everyone that Caine doesn't make use of social media and fancy tech, but the unholy gifts of the Dark Father, ritus, and vampiric gifts. As the Sabbat becomes more organized, the moderates effectively lose the political game, since the conservatives gain more power, which means said moderates have no choice but to dance to whatever tune is being played. But with said conservatives and loyalists being on the same level of power, tensions are bound to amplify until another major political conflict punches the sect in the face. So the Orthodoxy becomes a form of opium for the masses, hoping to create vincula between everyone to the point that clashes between opposing factions won't degenerate into physical destruction, and the emotional bonds between rivals will invite compromise from both sides. In the meantime, infernalism is still present, the Inquisition is in no danger of running out of work, and the Black Hand is as mysterious as ever. Absolutely gorgeous. I love this write-up. I love this sect. Camarilla games have their own distinct flavor, undoubtedly, but overall they still feel like a vampire mafia story with some magic sprinkled on top, right? Well, the Sabbat has a very turbulent and varied political climate with all these different factions, allowing troops to tell an impressive spectrum of stories. You want more group cohesion in your game, breathtaking combat, and, well, for lack of a better term, Exploration? Great, tell the story of a well-trained pack of ultra-conservative soldiers, including some Black Hand agents for good measure, sent on a raid into a Camarilla city, at which point their ductus proves incapable and must be removed if the pack is to survive in this situation, now that everything seems to have gone wrong. You want more weird magic stuff? Great! Tell the story of an inquisitor and a priest who can't really stand each other due to their conflictual, troubled past, being forced to investigate a mysterious occult item, let's say a tome, that was brought into the city by a nomadic pack which vanished suddenly, just after returning from their raid. The only thing left of them is this occult item and heaps of ashes. Infernalism is, of course, suspected. You want tragedy and horror? Awesome! Tell the story of how humane members of the Order of Saint Blaise repeatedly try to educate their brothers and sisters in Caine into ceasing their abuse of mortals, only for the whole initiative to fail miserably, as they are tasked by the ultra-conservative archbishop with providing all of the sacrificial victims for the greatest blood feast of the year, as punishment for their petty attempts to destabilize and weaken the Sabbat. They are forced to kidnap innocent people and prepare them accordingly for the festivities, losing their humanity and maybe even their minds in the process. You want politics? Tell the story of status quo members who have kept themselves in power and their city in balance for almost half a century, but now a destabilizing element, which can be any other faction really, tries to expand its influence, threatening to remove your protagonists from their positions of power by challenging them to monomachy. The challenge is legitimate. They cannot back out without losing faith or status or their very own lives. Will they survive this challenge? You want unadulterated freedom and chaos? Perfect. Play a group of loyalists who are sick of the oppression and ritus and hierarchy and everything, so they decide to just bring this entire system crashing down, at least within their own city, and return local Sabbat to their ideological roots. Freedom, baby. If this fails, they'll always be remembered as traitors, as terrorists, but if it succeeds, they will be heroes of the sect and the Loyalist faction. See my point? There is so much variation already written into the setting and the sect, so much conflict waiting to be explored, so many story possibilities which just aren't found in a Camarilla game. Not to mention the glorious, disastrous fun you can have when a pack is forced by circumstance to take in both an ultra-conservative and a loyalist, so the maybe Orthodox priest is doing their best to juggle these two without tearing the pack apart. It's entertainment for sessions to come, as long as players are on board with this. And best yet, you can take all of these elements I've mentioned and combine them, switch them up from session to session. You can have this amazing chronicle which walks players through everything the Sabbat has to offer. And it has a lot to offer, that's for sure. So there we have it. These are the political factions within the Sword of Caine, and in typical Loyalist fashion, I have no idea what the next episode is going to be about. Maybe Paths of Morality, maybe something else. But hey, having the freedom of choice is the most important thing, isn't it? This is what we fight for. This is what we die for. Thank you very much for listening. Take care, have fun, and stay free.